At 66, Loretta Fenn had $312, a folding table she'd saved from the estate sale, and the barn. The barn was on the back 40 of the Fenn farm outside Mapleton, Iowa, which had been in Glenn's family since 1941 and in their marriage since 1979, and was now, after Glenn's death in March, distributed among their 4 children through a will that Glenn had written in 2019 without telling Loretta, and that the attorney had read aloud in a conference room in Mapleton on a Tuesday afternoon in April, while Loretta sat with her hands in her lap and understood, word by word, what she was hearing. The farmhouse split 4 ways, value to be realized through sale, proceeds distributed equally. The equipment auctioned, proceeds distributed. The tillable acres sold to the adjacent landowner, who had made an offer within the week, proceeds distributed. The savings distributed. The truck to their son Dale. Glenn's tools to their son Kevin. The good furniture to their daughters John and Phyllis, who had already discussed this among themselves, which Loretta understood from the way they did not look at each other when it was read aloud. The barn to Loretta, with the note that the structure had been assessed at negative value due to required repairs, and that the parcel it sat on was not separately deeded, and therefore could not be sold independently of the farmhouse lot until a survey was completed, which would cost $2,400. Loretta did not have $2,400. After the distribution, she had $312. She had asked the attorney, quietly, while the children were talking among themselves, "Is there anything else? Any other document?" The attorney had looked at her for a moment and then said, "There is one other item." He produced a key, iron, old, on a piece of baling twine. He said Glenn had left it with the will with instructions that it go to Loretta and that she would know what it was for. She had taken the key and put it in her coat pocket and said nothing. She did not know what it was for. She and Glenn had been married for 44 years, and she did not know what the key was for. And she was not certain, sitting in that conference room, whether that frightened her or whether it was simply one more thing she had not known about the man she had believed she knew completely. She moved into the barn that evening. Dale had offered the farmhouse for a few more weeks until the sale closed, and John had offered the guest room in her house in Sioux City, and Phyllis had said she was sure they could figure something out, which was how Phyllis said things she did not intend to follow through on. Loretta had thanked them and said she'd be fine, and had put the folding table in the back of Kevin's truck, which he'd loaned her without asking why, and had driven the half-mile down the farm lane to the barn and carried the table inside and set it up near the east wall where the light came through the boards in long, dusty parallels, and sat down at it with her coat on. Because the barn was cold. She was 66 years old, and she had been a farmer's wife for 44 years, and she knew barns. This one was not falling. That was the first thing she noted. The siding boards on the south face had gone, and the cupola on the peak had lost its cap, and from the road you could see sky through the upper loft. But the timber frame, the great oak posts and beams that Glenn's grandfather had raised in 1941, was standing, and standing correctly, and would be standing when everyone in the family was gone. She sat at the folding table and put the key on it and looked at them both. Glenn had been a quiet man. She had known that from the beginning and had married him anyway, which she had never regretted, because quiet in Glenn was not distance. It was the quality of someone whose interior life was rich and private and did not require broadcasting. He had loved her. She had known that completely and without doubt for 44 years. He had not always been able to say it in ways she could hear, but she had learned to hear it in other ways. In the coffee made before she was up, in the way he checked her car's tire pressure without being asked, in the way he'd sat beside her through her mother's illness and her father's death, and the miscarriage in 1986 that they had never spoken of again, but that he had never. She was certain. Forgotten, he had written a will that gave the farm to their children and the barn to her, and he had left a key with the attorney with instructions that it go to her. He had not explained. He had not left a note with the will. He had trusted, apparently, that she would figure it out. She was going to figure it out. She spent the first day going through the barn the way she'd learned to go through things after 44 years of farm work, systematically, starting from the outside and working in, noting what she found before she moved anything. The timber frame was sound. The roof had failed on the north end, which had taken out the haymow floor above it, leaving a section of the upper loft open to the sky. But the failure was contained, and the main floor below it was dry, because the barn's overhanging eaves had kept the rain off that section of wall. The grain bins along the west wall, intact. The stanchions in the east section where the milking had been done, discontinued since 1978, when Glenn's father had moved to row crops, intact. The grain floor in the center of the barn, the wide oak boards, 3 inches thick, that covered the shallow grain cellar below, intact, dry, solid underfoot. She walked the grain floor twice, testing. On the second pass, her boot heel came down on a board in the southwest corner, and the sound was different. Not soft, not rot, but hollow where the other boards were solid. The sound of an airspace beneath a board that the others did not have. She crouched and looked. The board was the same age and cut as the others. The same wear patterns, but the joint on the east edge was different, not tongue and groove like the others, but a plain butt joint, fitted close, with a faint line of newer wood filler in the seam that had been stained to match and would have been invisible standing up. She went to the tool wall and got a pry bar. She worked it into the seam carefully, a little at a time, and the board came up. Not a board, but a section. 3 boards face, nailed to 2 cleats below, lifting as a unit, hinged at the far end on a piano hinge she saw when she had the near end up. She swung the section up on its hinge and latched it to a hook she found on the underside of the adjacent board, which had been put there for exactly this purpose. Below, not the grain cellar, which extended another foot down and was separated from this space by a timber frame. This was a separate pocket, 18 inches deep, lined with cedar planking, dry and clean, smelling of cedar and oil and something metallic. A safe. Not large, the kind sold at farm supply stores in the 70s for documents and small valuables, gray painted steel. Combination dial on the front, recessed into the cedar lining so the top of it sat flush with the cellar joist below the floorboards. Set into the ground under a barn floor, where no one would look, and where the earth's constant temperature would protect it from fire and weather both. She sat back on her heels and looked at the safe. She thought about the key. The key was iron, old, the kind for a simple lock. Combination safes did not open with keys. She looked at the safe more carefully, leaning down with the flashlight she'd found on the tool wall. Below the combination dial, almost hidden in the seam between the door and the body, a keyhole. The combination dial and a keyed lock both. The key would open the lock mechanism. The combination would release the bolt. She knew the combination. She had known it since 1979, because Glenn had given it to her that first year and said, "If anything ever happens, the documents are in the safe." She had thought he meant the safe in the house. The house safe, a small firebox under the bed, which she had opened after his death and found there important papers and his passport and nothing else. This was the other safe. She dialed the combination. Glenn's parents' anniversary, the date he had used for everything. She felt the mechanism align. She fitted the key and turned it. The door opened. She carried everything to the folding table in 2 trips. The safe held more than its outside suggested. It was deeper than it looked, extending back into the cedar-lined pocket. And at the back of it, things had been arranged with the care of a person who had been adding to a collection over time and had thought about how it was organized. A document box, metal, fireproof, with a hasp latch, a canvas roll tied with cord, a ledger, cloth cover, gray, smaller than an accounting ledger, more like a record book. A bundle of envelopes banded with a rubber band. A coffee can with a plastic lid, sealed with electrical tape. And in the front of the safe, set apart from the rest, as if placed there last, an envelope with her name on it in Glenn's handwriting, and nothing else written on it, just Loretta. She left that envelope on the table and opened the document box. Deeds, 4 of them, each one for a different parcel. She spread them on the table and read them in order. A half-acre lot in Mapleton, purchased 1988, a vacant lot on the edge of town. 12 acres of river-bottom timber ground in Monona County, purchased 1994. A commercial building in Sioux City, a small one, purchased 2001. And a deed she read 3 times before she understood it. The barn parcel, surveyed and separately deeded in 2018, 1 year before Glenn had written the will, the $2,400 survey already done, the separate deed already recorded. The barn parcel already free and clear, and in Loretta's name alone, transferred in 2018, 3 years before Glenn died. She sat with that for a moment. He had known. He had known what the will would do, and he had moved, first, in 2018, to make sure the barn could stand alone. The children would find out that the parcel was separately deeded, and they would understand that their father had done this deliberately, and they would have to sit with that. She opened the canvas roll, photographs, wrapped in oilcloth. She spread them on the table. Glenn at various ages, young, which she had rarely seen in photographs because Glenn's family had not been photograph takers, middle-aged at work, which she recognized because she had been there, and then a series she did not recognize at all, showing Glenn in settings she had never known about. Glenn at what appeared to be a job site, not a farm, in work clothes, with other men, looking at a structure under construction. Glenn at a table, with papers spread before him, in a room she didn't recognize. Glenn standing in front of the Sioux City commercial building, recognizable now from the deed, with his hand on the door. She turned the last photograph over. Glenn's handwriting on the back, in the notation he used when he labeled things. Fenn Building, Sioux City. 2001, 4L. She opened the ledger. Glenn's handwriting from the first page, in the careful notation of a man who kept precise records, 1981. Odd jobs, harvest season, nights and weekends. Saved separately from farm account. Purpose, Loretta. This account is not the farm's money. This account is mine and I am saving it for her. She read that twice. 1983, balance $1,940. Added $340 this year from the Henderson silo job. 1985, balance $2,900. Slow year on the farm. Added only $200. Did not touch this. He had been saving money, separately, secretly, under a barn floor since 1981. 2 years into their marriage. She had been 24 years old in 1981, and Glenn had been 28, and they had been farming in the particular desperate way of young couples farming in Iowa in 1981, which was to say barely, and he had been taking odd jobs at night and on weekends, and saving the money under the floor, and not telling her. She turned pages. The balance grew slowly, the way things grow when they are grown carefully. $500 in a good year, $200 in a bad one. By 1990, it was $8,000. By 1995, it was $14,000. The odd jobs gave way to a pattern she began to understand as she read. Glenn had invested in small properties. The vacant lot in 1988, bought for $3,200. The timber ground in 1994, bought for $8,500. The commercial building in 2001, bought for $31,000 after the balance had grown enough, and then rented, the rental income noted in the ledger with the same precision as the savings. January 2002. First rental income from the Sioux City building. Tenant, Marta's Alterations. $680 month, added to the account. She looked at the ledger for a long time. Glenn had been a real estate investor. Glenn, who had been so quiet about money that she had sometimes worried, who had driven the same truck for 11 years, who had said no to a vacation to see her sister in Arizona because they couldn't afford it that year. Glenn had been a real estate investor for 40 years under the barn floor, and he had not told her. She was not angry. She tried to locate anger and could not find it. What she found instead was something more complicated. The particular feeling of learning that someone you knew completely was also, in one precise and contained way, someone you did not know at all, and that the way you did not know them was not a betrayal, but a gift they had been building for 40 years, without telling you, because they did not know how to tell you, and because they wanted to. Give it whole. She opened the coffee can. Bills, bundled in amounts of 500, banded with rubber bands, stacked to the top of the can. She counted them at the table, $14,200. Underneath the bills, a strip of masking tape with Glenn's handwriting, petty cash. For whatever needs doing first. The rest is in the account, passbook is in the document box. She opened the document box again and found the passbook behind the deeds. First National Bank of Monona County, savings account, final balance recorded in Glenn's handwriting because he'd kept it manually since the bank stopped issuing printed statements in 2015, $87,441. She set the passbook down. She sat at the folding table in the barn that was hers, free and clear, separately deeded, and looked at the deeds and the ledger and the photographs and the passbook and the coffee can with its bundled bills, and she thought about Glenn, who had made her coffee every morning for 44 years, and had checked her tire pressure without being asked, and had sat beside her in the hard times without speaking, and who had also been doing this long, patient, private accumulation. The entire time. She picked up the envelope with her name on it. She held it for a long time. Then she set it down and went to make a fire. There was wood in the barn's south lean-to, dry, well stacked, of course it was, because Glenn had stacked it. She made a fire in the barn's old furnace, which was still connected, still functional, still reliable, because Glenn had maintained it. She put the kettle on the camp stove she'd packed in her bag and made tea, and sat back down at the table with the tea and the fire going, and the barn warming around her. And then she opened the envelope. Glenn's handwriting, in the deliberate way he wrote when he meant every word. Loretta, I have been trying to write this for 20 years, and I keep putting it away, because I'm not a man who says things well, and I don't want to say this wrong. I'm going to try to say it simply, and trust that you'll know what I mean the way you've always known what I meant, when I couldn't find the words. I started saving in 1981, because I was scared. We were farming in a bad time, and I didn't know if the farm would make it, and I didn't know what would happen to you if it didn't, and I couldn't say that out loud without it being a kind of failure, so I set it under the floor instead. I put money under the floor, because I didn't know what else to do with being afraid. The farm made it. We made it. I kept saving anyway, because by then it had become the thing I did that was mine and yours, and nobody else's. The kids didn't need to know. The farm's money was the farm's. This was different. This was for you. The building in Sioux City has a good tenant. She's been there since 2002, and her business is solid. Don't let anyone talk you into selling it quickly. The timber ground is worth more than the 1994 price. The lot in Mapleton I don't know about. Maybe build something on it? Maybe not. The barn is yours. I had it surveyed in 2018 when I knew I was going to write the will the way I wrote it. I want you to understand that I know what I did, and I did it deliberately. The farm was theirs to inherit. That is right, and I stand by it. But the barn was always yours. You're the one who knew it wasn't falling. You told me that in 1993 when I said we should tear it down, and you said, Glenn, that frame will stand 100 years. You were right. You have always been right about what stands. There's enough money to do whatever you decide to do. Fix the barn if you want. Build something on the lot. Help the kids if you want, or don't. That's for you to decide, not me. I have no instructions except this one. Don't be afraid. You never needed to be afraid. I just didn't know how to say so while I was standing in front of you. I love you. I have loved you since the day we met, and I have never stopped, and if there is any way to keep doing it from wherever I've gone, I intend to. Glenn Loretta set the letter down on the table. She put both hands flat beside it and looked at the barn around her. The great oak frame, the dusty shafts of late light through the east wall boards, the fire going in the furnace, the steam from her teacup rising in the warm air. She did not cry. Or she cried once, briefly, the way she had learned to cry since March, quickly and completely, and then finished. And then she folded the letter and held it against her chest, and sat in the barn that was hers, and listened to the frame settle around her, the long, slow conversation of oak and time. You have always been right about what stands. She had been right. She had been right for 44 years, and Glenn had known it, and had finally said so. Dale came the next morning. He drove the truck. His truck now, she reminded herself, and parked outside the barn, and came in and stood in the space with his hands in his jacket pockets, and looked at the safe still open on the floor and the table covered in documents. He was 40 years old, and he had his father's jaw and his father's discomfort in rooms where something emotional was happening. "Mom," he said. "Dale." He looked at the safe. "What is all that?" she told him. Not everything, not the letter, which was hers, but the documents and the ledger and the passbook and the properties. She watched his face as she told it, the way it moved through confusion and then something more complicated. He had all this, Dale said, and he never said. That was your father. The building in Sioux City. Dale sat on the milk stool she'd set by the table. I used to wonder how he was so careful with money. I thought it was just that. Being careful. He was careful, Loretta said. He was also building something. Dale looked at the ledger, at the columns of Glenn's handwriting going back 40 years. "What are you going to do?" he said. "Fix the barn," she said. "Stay." He looked around the barn, the timber frame, the grain floor with the trapdoor still open, the furnace going, the table with her tea. "You can't live in a barn, Mom. I'm living in a barn." He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "I can help with the roof. I know a crew." She said, "I know you do." He came back Saturday with a crew he'd hired himself and paid for himself, which she understood when she saw the invoice he left on the table marked paid in his handwriting without telling her. She let it stand. It was his way of saying something he did not know how to say otherwise, which was his father's quality, and always had been. She called the attorney, not the one who had read the will, but one she found herself. A woman in Mapleton named Doris Hale, who did real estate and estate work, and who, when Loretta laid out the documents on her conference table, looked at the separately deeded barn parcel and the trust structure Glenn had apparently set up around the account and said, "Your husband was careful." "He was," Loretta said. "The children can contest the separate deed if they believe it was executed to avoid the estate distribution," Doris said. "But the deed was recorded in 2018, 3 years before death, and the account was structured as a joint tenancy with right of survivorship, which means it passed to you at death without going through the estate. Both are legally solid." She looked up. "He had good counsel. He never told me he had counsel." Doris looked at her with an expression that was professional and warm at once. "Mrs. Fenn, your husband planned this for a very long time. I know. He came to see us in 2017. My predecessor, I was an associate then. He said he had a situation he wanted handled correctly and quietly, and he wanted to know if we could do that. We said we could." She paused. "He told us about you. About the barn, specifically. He said you'd told him in 1993 that the frame would stand 100 years, and that you were right, and he wanted to make sure you had it." Loretta looked at the table. "He remembered the year," she said. "He remembered the year," Doris said. She handled the estate questions. When Loretta asked about her fee, Doris said Glenn had paid a retainer in 2017 that covered whatever follow-up his estate would require, and had specified that the retainer should extend to Loretta for as long as she needed it. He had thought of everything. He had been thinking of everything for a very long time. The barn roof took 6 weeks. Dale's crew on weekends, Loretta on the ground handling materials and making lunch, which she did in the barn's south lean-to on the camp stove, and which the crew accepted without complaint, and with the particular gratitude of men doing physical work who are fed properly. She learned their names. She learned who took their coffee black and who didn't take coffee. She kept notes in a small book. The north end haymow floor went back in over 2 weekends. New lumber, properly sistered to the old joists. Dale and Kevin working together without being asked, which was the first time in several years they had worked together on anything. She watched them from below and did not comment. She fed them lunch. A woman named Gert Paulson came on a Thursday in June 70s, in a farm coat and good boots, carrying a pan of cinnamon rolls and the directness of someone who had decided to come and come. She had farmed the section east of the Fenn place for 40 years with her husband, now gone, and she had known Glenn since they were children, and she had something she wanted to say. She sat at the folding table. Loretta had added 2 chairs and said it. "Glenn fixed my combine in the fall of 2004 when my husband was sick and couldn't do it and I couldn't afford the dealer," Gert said. "He came over on a Saturday and worked all day and refused payment, and when I tried to give him something he said he'd eaten enough of my cinnamon rolls over the years to call it even, which wasn't true but was kind." She set the pan on the table. "I've been waiting to say thank you to someone, and now there's someone to say it to." Loretta looked at the cinnamon rolls. She looked at the ledger, open on the table, at the page for 2004 where Glenn had noted, in a different column she had not understood until now, GP Combine, 1 Saturday. No charge. He had kept a record of that too. He had a ledger, Loretta said. He wrote it down. Gert looked at the ledger. She pressed her lips together. "That was Glenn," she said. "He did everything twice, once with his hands and once in writing, so neither one would get lost." She stayed 2 hours. She came back Thursday with another pan and a list of people she said would want to know there was someone at the Fenn barn now. People who had known Glenn. People who had reason to come and say something. Loretta said she'd be glad to see them. They came. Not a flood, but steadily, the way people come in farm country when the word gets out, individually, with food, with a specific story, with the particular dignity of someone who has been carrying a gratitude for years and is relieved to have somewhere to put it. The Hendersons, whose silo Glenn had helped build in 1983. The Kowalski family, 3 generations of them, whose drainage tile Glenn had helped lay in 1997, without being asked. A woman from Mapleton named Beverly, who ran the food pantry, and who said Glenn had dropped off groceries every month for 15 years in the box by the back door at 6 in the morning, so nobody would see him. Each one appeared in the ledger. Loretta checked. Every one of them was in there, in Glenn's handwriting, the date and the work and the notation she had come to recognize as his abbreviation for no charge. NC, neighbor. NC, neighbor. Over and over, 40 years of it, in the columns beside the money he had saved, and the properties he had bought, and the account he had grown. The other ledger he had kept of a different kind of accumulation entirely. She began to do what the ledger had taught her. The Paulson farm needed a drainage problem, addressed that Gert's son couldn't afford this season. Loretta paid the tile contractor directly and told him it was from an anonymous neighbor. The food pantry in Mapleton needed a chest freezer. She bought it through the supply house and had it delivered and listed the donor as anonymous. She wrote each one in her own ledger, a new one she'd started in May, in the same format as Glenn's. She did not tell the children about the money for several weeks. When she told them all at once, on a Sunday, at the barn, which was by then weather-tight and warm and more itself. Their reactions were various. Dale was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was recalibrating something fundamental. Kevin said, "Dad." He said it like a complete sentence. Jan cried. Phyllis said, "I had no idea," which was true. And then, why didn't he tell us? Which was also a fair question, and one Loretta could not entirely answer. She said, "I think he wanted to give it whole." They sat with that. The young woman appeared on a Saturday in July, 22 years old, with a car that had a cracked windshield and the expression of someone who had been making decisions under pressure long enough that they had gotten good at it. Her name was Addie. She was a cousin of the Kowalski family, 3 removes, who had mentioned to Loretta that their cousin had just come out of a housing situation that had gone bad and was looking for something more stable. She knocked at the barn door. Loretta opened it. Addie said, "I heard you might need help." "With the barn? With the property?" Loretta said, "What kind of help can you do?" Addie said, "I can do almost anything that needs doing. I grew up on a farm. I'm not afraid of work." Loretta said, "I know." "The Kowalskis told me." She showed her the room off the south lean-to that she'd been thinking about since May, that she'd had Dale frame and drywall in June without explaining why. A window facing east. A small stove connection. Solid floor. No conditions. Addie looked at the room. She looked at Loretta. "Why?" she said. Loretta thought about Glenn, who had been afraid in 1981 and had put the fear under the floor and built something with it instead, and who had maintained it quietly for 40 years, and who had written, "Don't be afraid. You never needed to be afraid. Because someone built me something when I didn't know I needed it," she said. "I'm just keeping the building open." Dale came back in September. He didn't bring a crew this time. Just himself, on a Sunday morning, in the old truck he'd been driving less since he'd gotten Glenn's. He walked through the barn with his hands in his pockets and looked at the haymow floor, repaired, and the grain floor, repaired, and the trapdoor closed and latched from above. He looked at the room off the south lean to where Addie's light showed under the door. He looked at the folding table, which now had a proper table beside it, and the 2 chairs, and Loretta's ledger open on the surface. He stood at the table for a moment. He didn't pick up the ledger. "I could have done more," he said. "After Dad died, I could have. I was managing the estate and I was thinking about the practicalities, and Dale," he looked at her. "Your father used to say, 'Do what you can do and then do the next thing.'" She looked at the table, at the ledger, at the deeds and the document box at the table's edge. "You fixed the roof." He stood there for a moment. "I'll bring Kevin next week," he said. "There's a drainage issue in the lane. I can see it from the road." "I know," she said. "I was going to ask you." He nodded. He walked to the barn door and stopped and turned back. "The frame on this building," he said, looking up at the great oak posts and beams. "It's something. 1941, she said. Your great-grandfather raised it. It's not going anywhere." "No," she said. "It's not." She found the last thing in October, clearing the space behind the grain bins for winter storage. A flat stone, set differently from the others in the barn's original fieldstone foundation, set more recently. She could see that from the mortar, which was 40 years newer than the stone around it. She worked it free with a chisel. Behind it, a small cavity in the fieldstone, 8 inches deep, dry, lined with tar paper. Inside, in a Ziploc bag that had kept it sealed against moisture, a photograph and a strip of paper. The photograph was her. Loretta Young, she was 24, which put it in 1981, the year he'd started the ledger. She was standing at the barn door in the photograph, her hand on the frame, looking at something outside the frame, not at the camera. She did not remember the photograph being taken. On the back, in Glenn's handwriting, in the careful notation he used for things he wanted to last, Loretta. 1981, she knew what this barn was for before I did. The strip of paper, a single line, the same handwriting, the same ink, written the same year. She is the reason. Loretta sat on the fieldstone foundation floor with the photograph and the strip of paper and looked at them for a long time. She had been 24 years old. He had been 28. They had been married for 2 years and farming in a desperate time, and he had been secretly putting money under the floor out of fear. And he had also been doing this, keeping her photograph behind a stone in the foundation and writing, in private, the thing he could not say out loud. She is the reason. She put the photograph and the strip of paper in the envelope with his letter. The envelope went in the document box, with the deeds and the passbook in the safe, which she had returned to its place under the grain floor. She fitted the trapdoor back into its frame and latched it. She stood up. The barn was warm. The furnace was going. Through the east wall boards, the October light came in long and golden. The particular light of Iowa in October that she had been watching her whole life from this farm. She was 66 years old. Glenn had been building her something since 1981. She had been living in it the whole time and not known it. And now she knew it. And she intended to go on living in it for a very long time. On an October night when the first hard frost had come in off the fields, and the stars above Mapleton were very bright, and the barn held the day's warmth in its walls the way thick walls hold warmth, Loretta turned off the lamp on the table and stood in the dark for a moment. Outside, the fields, gone to stubble. The farm lane. The half-mile to the farmhouse where other lights were on now. A young family. New. The road beyond it. Inside, the furnace ticking low. Addie's light under the door. The grain floor boards, smooth under her feet. The trapdoor invisible in the dark. Above her, the oak frame, the great posts and beams, Glenn's grandfather's work, 83 years in standing. She put her hand on the nearest post. White oak, 8 by 8, pegged at the joints with locust, the way they built in 1941 when they built to last. cold at the surface, warm inside. She knew that about old oak, that it held its warmth deep in the grain and released it slowly. She had known that her whole life. She had not known until this year that Glenn had known she knew it, that he had been watching her know things for 44 years and had kept the record. She held her hand on the post for a while. Then she went to bed. The barn held the frost out and the warmth in, and the stars moved overhead, and the oak stood the way oak stands, without effort, without announcement, by virtue of being what it was and having been built right. Glenn had built it right. She had always known that. She had just not known, until now, how much of it he had built for her.